They said Africa would never rise again. They said the land of gold and glory would remain broken, divided forever. But today, something is stirring beneath the red dust of the Sahel. 6 armies, 6 nations, 1 heartbeat. Under the banner of President Ibrahim Traoré, soldiers once scattered by borders now march under a single sun. From Burkina Faso to Mali, from Niger to Guinea, a new alliance is born, not of convenience, but of conviction. And the world is watching. NATO calls it an unprecedented risk. But for millions across the continent, it is not a risk, it is redemption. It is the long-delayed dawn of African self-determination. So tonight, as we turn to the latest Burkina Faso news, we are not just talking about politics. We are talking about prophecy, about destiny, about the rise of a people who refuse to kneel again. If you believe Africa's story deserves to be told by our own voices, hit that subscribe button and let the world hear us roar. 6 nations, 1 oath. It began not with a war, but with a whisper that grew in the barracks, in the streets, in the hearts of young men who had nothing left to lose. They said, "We cannot be free if we must always ask permission." In the heart of West Africa, where the dust meets the sky, 6 flags began to wave not as rivals, but as brothers. Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, Guinea, Chad, and 1 more, watching closely from across the border. Each of them scarred by coups, sanctions, and decades of dependency. Each of them led by soldiers too young to remember colonial rule, but not too young to feel its shadow. At the center of it all stood a man, President Ibrahim Traoré, the captain-turned-revolutionary from Burkina Faso. Barely in his 30s, wearing a red beret and a heart of steel, he spoke not like a politician, but like a prophet. He said, "Africa will no longer crawl. Africa will stand tall and defend itself." His words became a call to arms. From Bamako to Niamey, the drums of Sahel began to echo again. The message was clear. The era of waiting for Western approval had ended, and in its place, a new alliance emerged, the alliance of Sahel states, a pact bound not by treaties written in French, but by promises whispered in the mother tongue. They gathered in Ouagadougou under the blazing sun, as if summoned by the ancestors themselves. Uniforms pressed, rifles gleaming, they stood shoulder to shoulder, 6 armies swearing a single oath: to protect one another, to defend Africa's soil, to never bow again. The crowd erupted, women ululated, children waved makeshift flags, elders wept, not from fear, but from pride. Because for the first time in generations, the people of the Sahel saw a vision of unity not dictated by Paris or Washington, but born from their own pain. Journalists called it defiance. But to the streets of Ouagadougou, it was resurrection. And across Africa, whispers turned to cheers. Sahel is awake. Sahel is alive. Meanwhile, the Western embassies sent cables back to their capitals. They spoke of instability, security concerns, and foreign influence. But those on the ground called it something else, the beginning of freedom. Yet, beneath the celebration, there was unease. 6 armies uniting is not a simple gesture. It is a statement of sovereignty and a threat to the old order. Because the last time Africa tried to stand on its own, leaders were silenced, movements crushed, dreams buried beneath sanctions and coups. Still, this time felt different. These were soldiers hardened by conflict, raised amid betrayal, and fueled by the memory of what their fathers lost. And at their head marched a man who did not seek permission, only purpose. As dusk fell over Ouagadougou, the 6 flags fluttered against the crimson sky. And while the people sang of unity, far away in Brussels and Washington, alarms began to ring. because for the first time in decades, Africa was moving, not under command, but under conviction. And as those 6 armies pledged their loyalty to one another, the corridors of Nato began to tremble. For they knew what began as a whisper in the Sahel could soon become a storm across the world. The day Nato trembled. When 6 African generals signed that pact beneath the blazing Sahel sun, the world did not cheer. It shivered. In Brussels, a NATO communiqué leaked within hours. The formation of the Sahelalliance poses an unprecedented risk to regional and global stability. The words were cold, bureaucratic, but behind them was fear. Fear of a continent breaking its chains. Fear of a people remembering who they are. In Washington, analysts called emergency briefings. In Paris, news anchors spoke in trembling tones about Moscow's hidden hand. And across the West, the question spread like wildfire. Who is truly behind President Traoré? The cameras zoomed in on Ouagadougou, expecting chaos. But what they saw were young men rebuilding roads, women planting flags, soldiers repairing schools. This was not an army preparing for war. It was a nation preparing for dignity. Still, the rhetoric escalated. The BBC called it a powder keg. CNN warned of a potential domino effect in the Sahel. And a NATO spokesman, with eyes hard as granite, declared, "We cannot allow a hostile bloc to form in the heart of Africa. The consequences would be unprecedented." But whose hostility was he speaking of? The hostility of a people who wish to defend their soil? Or the hostility of those who cannot accept that Africa no longer needs a master? Across the Atlantic, the mood was divided. Some in the United States, especially among African Americans, began to watch with quiet admiration. They saw in Traoré's defiance a reflection of Malcolm's fire, of King's dream untamed by compromise. Maybe, one commentator said, this is Africa's Montgomery moment, a stand against centuries of imposed order. Meanwhile, in Europe, the tremors deepened. France, once the unchallenged power in West Africa, faced a reckoning. Its troops were being expelled, its influence shrinking. For the first time, the empire could hear the echo of its own decline. The same lands it once called colonies were now forming coalitions, and this time, not under its watch. Diplomatic cables flew across continents, sanctions were discussed, aid was suspended. Western think tanks warned of Russian infiltration, pointing to the Wagner Group as the shadow behind the Sahel. But on the ground, the story was simpler. We have chosen our own destiny. We will make our own mistakes. Even as NATO's satellites hovered over the desert, they could not scan what was truly happening. The rise of an idea too powerful for drones or data to contain. Because in every village, from Mopti to Gao, from Fada to Niamey, the youth were saying one name. Not as a president, but as a promise, Traoré. The more the West warned, the more Africa listened, not to them, but to itself. And deep down, in the corridors of power, a truth began to settle like dust after a storm. Control was slipping away. Even within NATO, voices whispered of caution. "Do not push too hard," one diplomat said. "We might turn this movement into a revolution." But it was too late. The narrative had already changed. The world no longer saw the Sahel as a helpless frontier, but as the heartbeat of defiance. By the end of that week, a new map began to circulate online. A map showing a united Sahel standing tall beneath the words, "Africa for Africans." Western commentators dismissed it as propaganda, but elders across the continent looked at that image and wept. Because they had seen this dream before, in Nkrumah's speeches, in Sankara's courage, and they had watched it die. Now, in the eyes of a new generation, it lived again. Yet as the drums of hope echoed across the desert, the storm of retaliation began to gather. Sanctions, isolation, disinformation, the invisible weapons of empire were being loaded once more. And the question whispered in every Sahelian night was this: how much freedom can a people afford before the world calls it rebellion? Freedom's price. Freedom, they say, is never free. And for the people of the Sahel, the bill came due faster than anyone expected. Within days of the alliance announcement, Western banks froze millions in development aid. Contracts were suspended, flights canceled, sanctions rolled out like thunderclouds over the desert. Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, names once buried in back pages of global newspapers, now filled the headlines, each framed with the same warning: risk, instability, rebellion. But the people on the ground didn't see rebellion. They saw resistance. In Ouagadougou, markets fell silent for a week. The cost of fuel tripled. Imports stopped at the border. And yet, every evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, people gathered in the squares, singing the old freedom songs their grandparents once sang under Sankara. Their voices cracked with hunger, but not with surrender. Mothers sold food to soldiers at half price. Fathers stood guard through the night with sticks and faith. And the young, those whom the world called the lost generation, painted murals of their new heroes on the walls: Traore, Goita, Chiani, 6 faces of defiance rising from the dust. Western news called it desperation. But to those who lived it, it was deliverance. Because for once, they were suffering for a choice they themselves had made. And there is a strange kind of pride in chosen pain. Yet the pressure grew. International media flooded the region with stories of famine, division, corruption. Old power brokers whispered of coups within coups. The shadow of destabilization hung heavy, not from within, but from without. The same foreign powers that spoke of democracy had begun funding opposition groups and stirring fear. Old tactics, new names, a familiar dance. But this time, the rhythm had changed. In Niamey, one elder told a reporter, "They think we are poor because we have no money, but we are rich because we still have our dignity, and dignity cannot be sanctioned." And he was right. The sanctions bit hard, but not deep enough to break the spirit. In every city, in every village, something unexpected began to bloom. Solidarity. Families shared grain, soldiers built wells, neighbors protected each other from hunger. It was as if hardship itself had become the glue of unity. But not all could endure. Some lost hope, some questioned the cost, and some, seduced by the promise of normalcy, began to call for compromise. The West offered incentives: reopen your bases, restore your partners, and aid will return. It was a cruel choice, bread or pride. And yet, in the midst of this darkness, President Ibrahim Traoré stood before the people once more. He did not offer comfort. He offered courage. "The path to freedom," he said, "is not paved with gold. It is paved with sacrifice, and every generation must pay its price." The crowd roared. Men wept. Women lifted their hands to the heavens, because they knew he was not promising prosperity, he was promising purpose. Across Africa, the message resonated. From Accra to Addis, from Lagos to Luanda, people began to whisper, "Maybe it is our turn to stand." The Western media dismissed it as Sahel nationalism. But in truth, it was something far older, the reawakening of African self-respect. Still, the storm had not yet passed. Rumors of covert operations swirled. Leaked reports hinted at plans to destabilize the alliance. The pressure was mounting. But so was the faith. In the sermons of old churches and the prayers of desert mosques, a single refrain began to rise: "We will not bow again." And as the world watched, waiting for the Sahel to break, the people simply endured, battered but unbroken. Yet, even as the dust settled over the Sahel, the ripples reached across the ocean. In Washington, in London, in Paris, powerful men began to ask, what if this spirit spreads? What if the sons and daughters of Africa, on both sides of the Atlantic, begin to stand together? Across the ocean. When the drums of the Sahel began to sound, they were not only heard in Africa, they echoed across the ocean, through the streets of Harlem, the churches of Atlanta, the barbershops of Chicago. Among African Americans over 60, men and women who had marched with King or mourned with Malcolm, the news from Burkina Faso struck a chord too deep for words. For them, this was more than just Burkina Faso news. It was déjà vu. It was Montgomery, 1955. But this time, the bus was a continent. And the driver was not asking for fare, but for freedom. Many old veterans of the civil rights struggle spoke softly of President Ibrahim Traoré. They said his voice reminded them of Stokely Carmichael, of Thomas Sankara, a young man who refused to be afraid of history. Every century, one pastor said, God sends Africa a son who will remind her she was never meant to be a slave. In Washington, policymakers didn't share the sentiment. Behind closed doors, think tanks debated how to contain the narrative, how to frame this rising unity as extremism, how to dilute its appeal. But something was slipping through their fingers, not just in Africa, but in the hearts of Black America itself. For decades, the connection between Africa and her diaspora had been weakened by distance, by distraction, by despair. But now, as images of proud soldiers marching under one banner filled social media, something ancient stirred. People began to say, if they can stand there, maybe we can stand here too. In Europe, the conversation was more uneasy. Former colonial powers walked a tightrope between diplomacy and dread. Leaders spoke of partnership, but their eyes betrayed panic. Because if Africa learned to stand alone, Europe might have to stand on its own 2 feet as well. Meanwhile, across the global south, from Latin America to Asia, many nations watched with quiet solidarity. They knew this story by heart: the empire's warning, the sanctions, the media storm. They had seen it before, in Caracas, in Tehran, in Havana. But they also knew, every empire eventually fears the same thing, a people who no longer fear it. In the churches of Baltimore, in the mosques of Dakar, the same prayer rose like smoke. May those who seek freedom never lose faith. May those who fight for it never fight alone. And though separated by oceans, a strange unity was forming, not of armies, but of spirit. Because the struggle of one Africa is, in truth, the struggle of every black soul that has ever been chained, anywhere. And yet, as hope began to bloom across continents, one question remained: can a dream built in the desert survive the storm that's coming? A new dawn over the Sahel. The desert remembers. Every empire that marched through its sands, Rome, France, America, left behind the bones of its ambition. But now, for the first time in centuries, the Sahel stands not as a battlefield, but as a birthplace. A new Africa is rising, cautious, scarred, but unbroken. The alliance of Sahel states has become more than a pact. It is a promise whispered between generations. Young soldiers in dusty uniforms now speak of unity instead of surrender. Farmers till their land with a pride their fathers never knew. And students, once dreaming only of visas and visas, now dream of universities built by Africans, for Africans. President Ibrahim Traoré has become a symbol of that awakening. Not a perfect man, but a living metaphor. He represents a truth that many had forgotten: that no foreign nation will ever love Africa more than Africans themselves. The road ahead will not be smooth. The storms of politics, of propaganda, of poverty will come. But somewhere between the thunder and the silence, hope is taking root. In Mali, Engineers are rebuilding roads destroyed by war. In Niger, communities are sharing what little they have. And in Burkina Faso, a young generation chants, "We are not children of aid, we are children of courage." Across the continent, whispers of new partnerships emerge, not based on control, but cooperation. Trade within Africa is slowly growing. Regional defense systems are being discussed, and beyond the borders, nations once silent are beginning to speak with pride again. Yes, the world may still look at Africa through lenses of suspicion. Yes, NATO may still warn of unprecedented risk. But every sunrise over the Sahel tells a different story, of people who refused to stay silent, of nations that refused to kneel. This is not the end of the struggle. It is the beginning of self-definition. And as elders often say beneath the baobab tree, when the lion learns to tell his story, the hunter will no longer be the hero. So, as the winds of change sweep across the red earth, a single truth remains clear. The fight for Africa's soul has only just begun. Because freedom, once awakened, never sleeps again. And the next chapter of this story will not be written by history, but by us. From the dust, we rise. There comes a time in every people's story when silence becomes betrayal. And for Africa, that silence has lasted too long. But now, from the red dust of the Sahel to the shores of the Atlantic, voices are rising again. Old, weary, but unbroken. They speak of dignity. They speak of destiny. They speak of a tomorrow written not in the language of the colonizer, but in the rhythm of the drum. In the fire of faith, in the courage of unity, the world calls it risk. NATO calls it danger. But we, the children of Africa, and her scattered sons and daughters, we call it rebirth. In every headline of Burkina Faso news, behind every statistic, there beats the same truth. A continent rediscovering its soul. And in that rediscovery, President Ibrahim Traoré stands not as a savior, but as a reminder that sometimes God uses the humble to confound the mighty. He is not the first, and he will not be the last. For every Sankara who fell, a Traoré will rise. For every chain broken, another will rattle, until freedom becomes not a dream, but a daily duty. And to our brothers and sisters across the ocean, in Harlem, in Detroit, in the Carolinas, this story is not theirs alone. It is ours. Because when one black nation stands, the whole world shifts. When one African army refuses to bow, every descendant of Africa walks taller. So let the skeptics watch, let the critics warn, for as long as faith beats in our blood, the world will never silence the rhythm of our drums. Burkina Faso news is not just about politics. It is about prophecy. It is about a generation choosing courage over comfort, truth over fear. And now I ask you, my brothers and sisters, do you believe this is the dawn of Africa's new chapter, or just another battle in an old war? Tell me in the comments below. If you believe Africa's voice must never again be silenced, hit that subscribe button, share this message, and let the world know. The story of Africa is far from over. For from the dust, we rise. And this time, we do not rise alone.